is my head down, or is it maybe shame?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Since entering Parliament, Victorian Senator Ralph Babet has been making waves as a voice for the people. His most recent accomplishment was getting the Australian Senate to acknowledge and investigate excess deaths in Australia. No easy feat. And these are excess deaths that have not been seen since the Second World War. However, there's a brilliant man who's working behind the scenes with Senator Babet to help him hold the establishment accountable. And this individual happens to be my next guest tonight. My next guest is a husband, a father of 3 children who lives in the Adelaide Hills, and he also happens to be a natural-born leader and a lover of truth. He grew up on the land, on his family farm, and he's operated his own finance business for the past 10 years. He's a former lead UAP federal candidate from 2022 who currently works as an advisor for Senator Ralph Babet. Michael Arbon, welcome to Cafe Lockdown.
Thanks so much for having me, Leon. I love the work that you guys do at Cafe Lockdown, and Michael's been a trooper since day one, hasn't he?
That's right. You're certainly no stranger to Cafe Lockdown. So Michael's obviously interviewed you in the past. But let me ask you this, Michael. You've got a life. You're a father, 3 children. You're an accomplished businessman. Why on earth would you want to get into the world of politics?
To be completely honest, why would anyone want to get into politics? It's a dirty game, but that's the reason why I'm there, Leon, because politics is occupied right now by the wrong people, the people that want to be there for a career or for their own personal ambitions, largely. There's a few good people that are elected in the federal parliament, but the vast majority of them are political animals. They've wanted to be a politician since day dot. They studied politics and arts and law, and they worked as a staffer. Well, now I'm a staffer, but I worked in the real world beforehand. So I think to come in there with that outside perspective, to have, taken a few hits along the way and then put your hand up to have a crack and try and make Australia a better place. And I think we just do it for our children. I don't really care so much about my lifetime, but it's about my kids and their kids. I want to make sure that I try my best to hand on a country that is going to treat them well or treat them as humans and guarantee them certain rights.
I suspect that the last 4 years have been a wake-up call for a lot of people, and it's certainly brought in people who otherwise would never get involved in the dirty game of politics into politics. Now, Michael, you recently attended the Digital ID rally. So, and that in Adelaide, and there were rallies all over the country in every major city. The government is saying that it's voluntary, and it's supposedly for our safety. So, what's the issue? What do you think is the issue?
I oppose this bill, and Senator Babet opposes this bill on one fundamental principle, and that is a pretty basic principle that we don't trust the government or future governments to be given powers which can be used or abused to restrict our basic inalienable human rights. And digital ID is one of those. If you look at the bill as it's currently drafted, it says, it's got a section, I think it's section 74, that says creating and using a digital ID is voluntary, right? That's exactly what we wanted to hear. And the minister always tells us that it is voluntary. But if you read on in that section, immediately below those words are a whole bunch of exemptions that are already listed. So baked into the bill as it currently stands, they have the words that it is voluntary, but then the digital ID regulator at their own discretion can grant exemptions to that at any time in the future. And, I'm sure the exemptions will be rare at first, but as time goes by, we're going to see more and more exemptions granted. And we don't trust those exemptions won't extend to certain things which would take away rights from the Australian people.
They said that the vaccines were voluntary as well, didn't they?
Well, yeah, and Leon, I'm hoping they treat these exemptions pretty similarly to what they did for vaccine mandates. It was as rare as hen's teeth trying to get an exemption to a vaccine. So You would hope they would treat the digital ID the same way, but I'm skeptical. I don't believe they will.
There's always the devil's in the detail. There's always a little asterisk that comes with whatever they say, conditions apply.
Correct. And, you don't even need something written into law to bluff the Australian people, as we learned over the past few years as well. There was a lot of actions taken by government which legally are very questionable. But all you need is a little bit of bluff and the media on your side, and you can convince people to do things and to follow instructions which really go against their conscience, go against what they believe is right.
Again, we saw that with the vaccine mandates. It seems that there's a direct connection with the vaccines to the digital ID. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me on this, but what they did with the MyGov, where you had to have your vaccine status uploaded, that seemed to have been like a trial run for the digital ID. Would I be correct in making that assumption?
Yeah, well, I would assume that the massive amount of compliance that the government saw during those years probably emboldened them to put this bill forward to have a crack at it. And I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that, yes, it's it's a Labor Party bill, the Digital ID Bill of 2024, but the Liberal Party had a Digital ID Bill as well. It was the 2021 Trusted ID Bill, which I had to read through that as well. And it also had those words that said the ID would be voluntary, but it also had a section below it that had a whole bunch of exemptions listed, exactly like Labor's. And what this proves is that when governments change between Liberal, Labor, Labor, Liberal, the bureaucrats don't change. The guys that are feeding the policy and the legislation up to the ministers and the government, their ideas are still the same. Their ideas generally come from the globalist bodies, the UN, the WHO, the WEF. They go to those big think tanks and they listen to their information, and then they come back with all these fresh ideas, and the politician, who in many cases is just a useful idiot, adopts those ideas and introduces the bill.
So essentially a puppet.
Yeah, essentially, or maybe lacks the integrity to take an action which may be not in their career's best interest in politics, but the right thing for the Australian people. I actually think we lack real leadership in politics. There's very few politicians who last long term, who are willing to run with their conscience and do what is right, even if it's politically inconvenient.
And there seems to be a lot of moving parts that don't seem to be connected, but perhaps they are. You can clarify that. There's also there's a lot of different things that the government's trying to introduce.
Yeah. So I guess what you're talking about here is the slippery slope. And slippery slopes have often been dismissed as being that easy way out to oppose a certain policy. But we know the slippery slope is real. And Leon, if I'm able to say, it's probably Teflon coated. It's a very, very slippery slope at the moment. And we've seen it socially with things like abortion to birth and euthanasia, and all of these things have become a norm. We are now legalizing killing people at the end of their lives, which is something I never thought we would see in the society. A medical profession who are supposed to preserve life are now also being asked to take life. That is completely upside down and wrong. And with the Digital ID Bill, for example, we know that we've had a trial running in Australia of central bank digital currencies. So the banks have been trialing CBDCs, and central bank digital currencies aren't just like the electronic money we have now. They're more complicated than that. They're trackable and traceable, and they can be programmed, which means that one day in a future dystopian government, if we were led by authoritarians, for example, you could link a digital identity to a central bank digital currency and then start imposing restrictions on a population, things like, say, a carbon allowance. If climate change and this hysteria around that continues, maybe one day the all-knowing government might believe that imposing a carbon limit on the citizens is the way to save the world. And if that's linked to your currency and the way that you pay for items, you might not be able to buy meat this week because you've met your allowance, or you may not be able to refuel your car for another month because you've used your 40 litres of diesel for the month. And I know these things sound crazy, but they're not beyond the realms of possibility. And the best way to prevent that would be opposing a digital ID and making sure they don't have the framework that they need in the future to abuse legislation that already exists.
I want to challenge you on one thing. It doesn't sound crazy because we got a preview to that during the vaccine mandates when they weren't allowing people into shops and into cafes and into the workplace, all because they refused to comply with the tyrannical edicts of the government. And there's also another thing that the government wishes to roll out, or they've already introduced. They nicknamed her, affectionately nicknamed her E-Karen, otherwise known as the E-Safety Commissioner. This is a former disgruntled Twitter employee. Now, does the government have the right to be the arbiter of what is safe and dangerous in terms of what is online?
Absolutely not, Leon. Free speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, they're all basic, fundamental, inalienable rights, in my view, and that of Senator Babbitt. There are certain rights that are given by God that government must not and cannot police, and free speech is one of those. And, I believe that the best answer to what the government would deem to be harmful speech or mis or dis or malinformation is actually free speech, because what happens in a society is someone will say something that's blatantly wrong or false. You have the opportunity to correct them and call it out and replace that lie with the truth. The truth always overpowers the lie if the truth is allowed to see the light of day. E-Safety Karen, as she's called, she was originally given her powers. Once again, I'm going to smash the Liberal Party today, but it's fair enough because they did these things. They passed the Online Safety Act in 2021. That gave her initial powers. Obviously now the Labor Party have gone, great idea, Liberals, let's make her powers a little bit stronger. And they've released an exposure draft for the misinformation, disinformation bill. So this is going beyond the scope of what we ever thought could happen. And they're now essentially going to enforce almost state-sponsored speech. If your opinion or what you say goes against what the government deems to be their truth, which has been wrong often over the past few years, you run the risk of being cancelled. But social media companies and alternate media platforms especially run the risk of massive fines. And what we could end up with in Australia, if this was to occur, I wouldn't blame social media companies for vacating our country, to be honest, because the risk to them would be too great. Massive fines, massive risk. And then what would happen as a society for us is we would lose the modern day town square. Speech would be controlled and we wouldn't be able to share information as freely as we can right now. And that would be a tragedy for democracy. It would be, I would call it light touch communism. It's getting close to communism when the state is starting to censor speech. And Leon, I'd say probably the most disturbing part of the misinformation, disinformation draft that they sent around was that there was exemptions to who was captured under this legislation. So it was obviously the government, they're exempt, they can lie. It was educational institutions, and it was mainstream media. So those three outlets are exempt from the law. What I'd like to see is, I'd love them to introduce the bill, but maybe we should flip the terms of reference to exempt everyone apart from government, education and mainstream media. That's the way I want to see it.
Absolutely. And do you think eventually we keep going on this trajectory? Do you think that the Safety Commission or the commission, whatever they've set up, that department to monitor speech on the internet and police it, do you think that will be essentially linked up to the digital ID?
Look, there are no plans to do that at the moment, obviously, but there are no plans to do a lot of things until they become reality. Government actually, they can be silly at times, but they can also be really smart. So the best way to achieve an end goal is to do it incrementally, bit by bit, in small bite-sized chunks that the population can tolerate. So at the moment, the digital ID, it won't be compulsory. When it first comes in, it won't be as scary as we think it will be. But the trouble is, we're thinking not in election cycles, we're thinking 10, 20 years down the track, what could happen? And we're trying to make sure that legislation doesn't pass now that allows a bad outcome for future generations. Whereas Governments, they only think in 3-year cycles at best. They just want to get re-elected and they want to move on with the next term. So for now, it won't be scary, but yeah, there is a chance that this could happen because at the moment, they don't have the power from a legislative perspective to do something like that. But passing a digital ID bill, which includes the capacity to grant exemptions to it not being compulsory, well, technically in the future, this could happen. You're right. But obviously there's no plans right now. That's why we have to nip it in the bud. And the digital ID bill did pass the Senate. And I'd just like to give you a bit of detail on how that occurred and just how undemocratic the process was. So on the day the digital ID bill passed, that morning the government moved a motion to amend the order of business for the day. So the order of business is kind of just like the agenda for a meeting. Today, at 10 o'clock we'll do this, at 1 o'clock we'll do that. The digital ID bill was one of, I think, about 10 bills on the list that day. And we knew that we weren't going to get either to the bill at all, and it definitely wouldn't pass because it's a bill that would probably be debated in the Senate for multiple days. So that means it would be delayed by a few months until it pops up again in the Senate. We'll have a proper debate. We'll talk about all the things that are wrong, try and amend it, try and improve it, and actually try and get it voted down. But unfortunately, the government got the support of the Greens, some crossbenchers, and Senator David Van was the difference, actually, the former Liberal Party senator that now sits on the crossbench from Victoria. He sided with the government and allowed for the suspension of standing orders and the change of the order of business. So that meant the digital ID bill would pass without any debate allowed at all. Zero debate. The Senate's role is to be the House of Review. Its job is to go through every bill line by line by line and make sure that there is nothing in there that is wrong or could be abused by a future government. And that opportunity wasn't given. So that bill passed the Senate in one day, no debate. And now it hasn't come to the House yet, to the lower house. I expect it will return in the next couple of sittings, probably, to the House. Labor control the House, so they do have the numbers. But what we're calling on the Australian population to do is to absolutely hammer your member of parliament. Let them know that this cannot pass. It cannot pass because it is not right. It hasn't been done properly. And at very least, they should have given the Senate due time to debate this and at least call out the things about this bill that are wrong.
Unbelievable. And look, the fact that, if you go on your MyGov website, you log into your portal, the fact that there's a person's vaccine status is still up there, that in itself is quite terrifying. But this is obviously even more terrifying. So that's why, everyone that's watching this needs to follow Michael's advice and contact your local member and go out to protests and be involved in activism.
And one other thing, Leon, that I would like to touch on is the fact that this isn't the first form of digital ID we have in Australia. So if you're a company director, you have to have a MyGov ID already. There's 10.5 million of those that already exist in Australia. So when they say it's not going to be compulsory, it kind of already is in a different form. If you want to run a company in this nation, you already have to have a digital ID. Now, that ID just serves one purpose. The trouble with this one is I'm sure they're going to try and integrate pretty much all government services. And once you integrate all government services on the one platform as well as your ID, they have serious capacity to restrict your access to government services as well. You want to speak to Centrelink, you want to apply for a pension, you want to lodge your BAS, you want to access your income statement for your year, you're probably going to have a MyGov ID one day because they're going to say it's more efficient, it's safer, it's more secure, and you can trust the government. But I don't trust the government.
And speaking of when the government uses the word safe, and then there's safe and effective, Senator Ralph Babet recently had some phenomenal success in getting the Senate. And you obviously played a really big part in that, being the senator's advisor, getting the Senate to actually acknowledge excess deaths not seen since the Second World War and getting it to investigate. Can you give our audience an update on how that's going at the moment?
Yeah, so this is the power of minor party crossbenchers. The pandemic years were heavily abused by government. So much bluff, so much censorship, and so many bad mistakes financially and from a health perspective that were made by government and public servants. And one of the issues that Senator Babbitt was elected on the back of was the fact that more Australians were dying than we've seen since World War II. So a lot of excess deaths. And even if you believe the government numbers in terms of COVID-19 deaths, which had a pretty broad criteria, it didn't always have to be a primary cause of death for it to be counted as a COVID death. But even if you believe those numbers, the excess on top of COVID deaths is extraordinary, right? So this is something that's been identified by the Bureau of Statistics and by the Actuaries Association and so many different other sources. It's fully legit. And Senator Babbitt, since he was elected, he moved 5 separate motions on the issue of excess death and spoke about it many times. And the first motion, we only had 3 people vote in favour to establish a committee. It was Senator Babbitt, Senator Hanson, and Senator Roberts. Following that, Senator Babbitt moved multiple more motions, but this year, the first motion he moved this year, the Senate actually acknowledged that the issue is real and worthy of investigation. So we backed that up a month later with a motion to refer to committee to inquire into the underlying causes and how to get on top of this issue of excess deaths. And we're very thankful for the support of like Senator Pocock, Senator Lambie. They got behind us and actually backed this motion.
That's a surprise.
Yeah, and the Liberal Party got behind us as well. So we're thankful for their support too. But look, everyone sort of had a different reason to look into it, whether it be the fact that during lockdowns, people turned to alcohol and there's more alcohol-related deaths. And, you know, obviously you've got the elephant in the room of the novel vaccine products that are being rolled out, rushed out. And, you know, we've got well over 100,000 reported adverse events and well over 1,000 reported deaths in Australia. And the reporting system is very restrictive. So we know there's more people out there who haven't reported. But those numbers alone should scare the pants off governments and those that were in positions of power who made these decisions to take a punt on the population. So we've got the committee up and running. It's still open for public submissions for another week or so. So if people just Google excess mortality inquiry, it'll pop straight up. If you put the word Senator Babbitt in, you'll find it. And I would urge people, you've still got another week or so to put in a submission. And even if it's 1 or 2 pages, put this on the record. Make the senators in this committee read your submissions. Tell your real stories. Like the number of phone calls and emails we've got over the past 2 years since Senator Babbitt was elected of people who are either injured or had family members die either as a result of the vaccine or as potentially linked to it. It's enormous and it breaks your heart. And we do need to see some justice. But it's not just the vaccine. Like lockdowns are brutal. People died in aged care homes because they were just lonely. They had no life. You know, people were separated from dying loved ones and not even able to say goodbye. There were so many things that happened during that period which are just absolutely wrong and inhumane. And there's a lot of factors that have probably contributed to this excess death. I think lockdowns are definitely one, closure of borders, masking, whatever it was, and a lack of alternate treatments as well. The fact the government restricted doctors' ability to prescribe treatments and the government neglected to even tell people to exercise and take basic things like vitamin D and vitamin C. You know, all of those things matter. And, you know, if you're at high risk, you've got to do everything you can, but they put all their hopes on this panacea of a vaccine, which has just ended up becoming a total joke that never restricted, never stopped transmission, never prevented death. And now it's being proven to be potentially deadly. Like AstraZeneca, the company's admitted in recent days that it does cause death. We knew that back in early 2021 when they started putting restrictions on the products, but our government officials kept pushing that for so much longer when they knew there was a signal and a problem. We need some justice, and we're hoping that this inquiry can deliver that. Once the submissions close, the committee will review all those submissions, and then they've also told us that we're going to have a public hearing. So there'll be a day in Canberra when witnesses will come along to the Senate on the record publicly, and they'll have their day to present their facts and to answer the questions of senators. And public hearings are probably the most powerful thing that the Senate has. It's a really powerful tool because very rarely do you get to face them eye to eye, man to man, and genuinely deliver the answers to them in the flesh. And There's going to be a lot of truth spoken that day. The committees normally run it pretty well. They usually allow sort of half a day for each side of the argument or the various opinions to get across. So we've got some experts from right around the world who are chomping at the bit to be able to present to the Australian Senate, because excess deaths is not just an Australian issue either. It is global, and it's an issue that no country, this is the world first, no country has faced head on like Australia is about to.
It appears to be only the countries that have had high vaccine uptake that are experiencing excess deaths. And if you compare it to Sweden, a country like Sweden didn't enforce these insane COVID policies, or not as much, is not experiencing, not even close to what Australia, Canada, the UK and other countries that have had this COVID madness are experiencing at the moment with excess deaths. Do you think with the inquiry into the excess deaths, how objective do you think and transparent do you think it will be? Do you think, because some skeptics are saying that it might just be a case of the government investigating itself? Yeah,
so the government, the Labor Party government opposed the motion to investigate, and so did the Greens. So it was Labor and Greens that opposed it. So they didn't want to look into it, but they weren't really in government for the majority of this time. But what we will recall is that most of the state premiers were Labor Party premiers, and Scott Morrison was a relatively weak leader, if I'm to put it nicely. And what he did was, in many cases, he handballed it to the states because he didn't want to take control. He didn't want to take ownership, and he let the states run wild. He let them make some crazy decisions and largely remain silent. So I think a lot of the hesitancy to look into this is because the Labor Party state premiers are largely on the hook for these decisions. But I blame the federal government just as much, if not more, because they had a voice and they have the power to legislate, and they have certain powers that they did not act on. And at very least, they should have been yelling and screaming and opposing the actions of the states to make sure that we knew what they were doing was wrong. Will it be objective? Well, the committee, obviously, because the government is a Labor Greens government pretty much, and they have the numbers, the majority of the committee is what I guess you would call left-leaning, and it's obviously chaired by the left. But, I think it's the process that matters more than their final report. The opportunity to actually put on the record, all these submissions will be publicly there. They have to read them. They have to review them. And the public hearings, that'll be the opportunity, which is completely uncensored, to speak publicly to these people and explain the truth as to the reasons that are behind these excess deaths. So, yep, the final report matters. But I think what matters more is about getting things on the public record and allowing full disclosure and full questioning of the people that need to be questioned.
And I find it interesting that they only recently withdrew the AstraZeneca so-called vaccine. I hate to use that term to describe it, but they recently took it off the market. So my question is, what took them so long? I mean, the blood clots were well known that it was causing blood clots since the start, since it was rolled out 3 years ago.
Well, I saw a couple of different headlines over the last couple of days for that. So you'll see certain headlines saying that they admitted in court that their vaccine has killed people and that it's been withdrawn from the market. But you see other more mainstream media articles saying it's been withdrawn because it's no longer economic. So I guess they're just not making as much money as they used to. But how can you lose when you've been granted indemnity and you're getting paid for a product with no risk? It's all cream, isn't it? And we signed contracts for tens of millions of doses in advance, paid for them and didn't use them. Lots of them are getting thrown out and expiring because after 2021 especially, the Australian people worked out that these things aren't a panacea. They're not going to stop you catching COVID. And quite frankly, I don't know anyone who didn't get vaccinated who regrets it. So, people have woken up to the fact that these products are new. They're not effective at stopping transmission, and you're not going to kill grandma if you don't take it, like we were told. And the only reason the majority of people took them was because their livelihoods were threatened. Exactly. It must have been a really, really difficult decision for a parent, especially with kids and a mortgage, to decide between losing their livelihood or taking this novel product. They were literally left with very little decision other than financial ruin or taking a risk on this product. And I just hope that's never repeated. I don't trust that it won't be at the moment with the government that we currently have. It really is only the minor parties that truly oppose vaccine mandates. It's the vast majority would still be in favour, I would say. So yeah, I don't know. It took them a while, didn't it? It took them a very long time, but I actually think it's the beginning of a lot of admissions. It's the beginning of a lot of blame shifting, as we've seen Greg Hunt this morning have a crack at Dan Andrews, when Greg Hunt was the one that said that this is the largest clinical trial in human history. Like, you can't take your words back from 2021. That's what you said.
Exactly.
And you were backing it. So you've got to own it. What I would love to see is a bit of repentance and a bit of acknowledgement of fault from those who are in positions of power. I think I would deeply respect someone to come out and say, I was wrong and I apologise, because we haven't seen that. All we're seeing at the moment is blaming someone else, but you've got to own it. You made the decision, and you would earn a lot of respect if you came out and said, I was wrong.
Absolutely. I think I don't think I've ever met or come across a politician, a bureaucrat, who was capable of doing any introspection and saying sorry. They always seem to be shifting the blame and deflecting onto someone else. That seems to be their standard MO.
Yeah, when you think about the Australian people, we love self-deprecating humour. We love people that can take the piss out of themselves, right? If only the politicians got the memo and understood they weren't God and that they do make mistakes, maybe a bit of humility would be really well received by the voting population as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned before about people, having to essentially take this experimental medical intervention because their livelihoods are being threatened. And that's a sad reality. When you threaten a person's livelihood, there's a very big chance that they're going to cave in and take it. And the powers that should not be are banking on that. And, at the end of the day, they could, like you alluded to, they could do it again. They could do something similar in the future. And they're banking on the fact that people are just going to follow. They're going to go along to get along, because that, unfortunately, is the mindset of the masses. Now, Billboard Chris, Ralph recently interviewed him. He was on a tour of Down Under. I just want to ask you a question. It's related to Billboard Chris, to his activism. But if you were to come 10 years ago, if Chris was around 10 years ago, walking around with sandwich board, with, you shouldn't give puberty blockers to minors as young as 8 or under 10, the natural response will be, well, duh, Captain Obvious, we know that. What that's a, pretty non-controversial statement. Why are you even saying that? How do we get to a point, 10 years or so down the track, where that's suddenly controversial, and you've got poor Billboard Chris getting assaulted on university campuses on the streets of Australia just for making that really simple statement? How did society get to that point?
It's on us, I would say, because as a population, we've probably had it too good for too long. We've had it too easy in Australia. Most people, if you work relatively hard, can live a reasonably comfortable life. We are still a lucky country, even though there's quite a few things wrong at a government level. We are a fortunate country. And I think that, when you haven't had tough times, you get comfortable, you get complacent. And probably for the last 20 or 30 years, if you roll up to a polling booth, for example, most people are disappointed or angry that they have to vote. They hate politicians generally. If you ask people 10 years ago, how do you know a politician's lying? They'll say their lips are moving, but then they don't do anything about it. So we love to stir up politicians, and we love to look down on them, but we don't engage in the process. We don't.
That's an interesting point.
Participate in politics, right? And it's our fault for vacating that space, because as we vacated it, the professional politicians have stepped in. The career politicians have taken over, and the one thing they lack is the connection with the real world. They only know politics, and politics is a game. It's a numbers game, but it's also a game of manipulation and a game of media and a game of control and controlled narratives. And if you are in politics and you want to stay in politics, you need to be able to communicate a message and maintain favour and get re-elected. And what these career politicians do is they play it safe and they answer to the loudest voice. And the loudest voices that have been engaged in politics over the past 20, 30, 40 years have been the Marxists. They've completed their long march through the institutions. They've captured the schools and the universities. They've bit by bit, as we always say, they've incrementally expanded their Overton window the wrong way. And they've made the Australian people comfortable with things. You know, probably gay marriage was a massive step forward for the Marxists. But it didn't end there, did it? It didn't end with gay marriage. Now we've got an alphabet of different letters which are supposed to be socially acceptable. We've got a whole bunch of minorities that they bring together. You know, the voice referendum taught them a little bit of a lesson that the Australians can say no. That's not enough. That was just one vote. We still haven't done anything to fight back materially. So I think, you know, we've let it slip and the Marxists have taken that opportunity. The Greens have played a really smart role of capturing local government and then the upper house, which is the next easiest target. And now they're starting to win lower house seats around the nation. So, you know, in a lucky country where you've got things too good, you don't really have anything material to worry about. So therefore you vacate big picture thinking and politics and you allow all these non-mainstream ideas to slip in and almost become a norm that you tolerate. I say just say no and don't tolerate it, because the more we tolerate, the further they're going to go.
We've got into a situation where the lunatics are essentially running the asylum. And we're in a situation, I just don't understand this dichotomy. So you need to be over 18 in this country to smoke, to drink alcohol, but a person under that age, and obviously, you know, to have sexual relations, you have to be over 16 and age of consent. But if a child wants to take puberty blockers or cut off their breasts, etc., do something really life-changing that would change them that's irreversible, they can essentially do that and get away with it without parental consent. I just find that mind-boggling.
How can we be in a society where we can mutilate and sterilize children and say that it's in their best interest because they want it? You know, there are right and wrong. Right and wrong does exist. I know in the modern society it's wrong to say that, you know, how dare you judge someone? But there are basic morals and basic truths, like the fact that sex and gender, well, gender is binary. It's male and female. Anything else is a mental illness. You are not a cat. That is a fact. And in South Australia, where I live, Leon, I don't know if you caught it last week, but we actually have a South Australian police officer who, when she's not on duty, identifies as a cat. I don't know. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie from the early 2000s, Super Troopers, where they pull over someone and they have a competition as to who can say the word meow most often. That comes straight to my mind. I'm looking forward to getting pulled over by this cop and getting spoken to in a cat language. That'll be hilarious.
The furries phenomenon. We've had that in Melbourne. A number of media reports have come out that certain schools are catering. They're mostly private schools, which is really interesting. It's usually the private school kids that have become the most woke and, you know, the Marxists, etc. And the teachers there, the school administration is catering to their needs. So if they identify as a cat, they would put out a cat litter and a little cat box and, you know, a little place for them to sleep and drink their milk, etc. So they're catering to their delusions.
Where are the parents in these schools? Why aren't the parents doing their job and standing up for the truth and actually convicting the leaders of these schools and calling out the stupidity of what they're doing? That's what bothers me. Like, I got 3 young kids, and if I heard that was happening in my school, I would be in the principal's office in 5 minutes, and I would have probably 10 parents with me, and we would sort that out there and then, because it's not something that can be tolerated. It's not true. It's not right. That child needs help. And more importantly, I think the child's parents need a lot of help, because as a parent, you need to train your children right, and you need to call them out when something is obviously wrong. And that child's not a cat. That child needs serious support and help.
Absolutely. And I mentioned before the lunatics running the asylum. How do we get the lunatics out? So from my own past observation, I've seen that the minor parties, I could always be corrected on this, is just my own perspective, don't appear to be working together. The minor parties on the right and the centre right, they seem to be undermining each other, taking each other's votes away. I saw that in the Victorian state election. They say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. Do you envision that in future elections, the minor parties would be working more closely together? Would there be some form of coalition perhaps in the future?
I pray there is, but probably what is the most important is that the voters understand how voting works as well. So, when you vote, you choose your own preferences. It's a massive misconception of you're giving your preferences to so-and-so. No, it's just a piece of paper. It's just a recommendation. When you vote, you choose how you vote. And often there are mistakes made. Like, I look at the results of 2022 federal election, and there's a lot of vote leakage to parties that you would not expect. Like, someone that might vote one UAP, but then the Greens get the vote for One Nation. How does that happen? That's obviously just a lack of education of the voter, because if you give all the minor good parties with the right candidates that have your values, your first, second, third, fourth, fifth preference, every single one of those candidates has a chance of getting elected. But if you go one United Australia Party, two Liberal Party, that vote's gone to the Liberal Party, never going anywhere else, because they'll end up with them. So I think the messaging is really important. And from a political perspective, in federal parliament, we work so closely with the friendlies, it's not funny. So Malcolm Roberts, Pauline Hanson, Alex Anti, Gerard Rannick, they're fantastic senators. They all work really hard, and you'll probably notice that, they work together on a lot of issues. Senator Canavan also does some really good work. So, there's 6 or so really good senators in there, and then a bunch of others that are probably just on the fringe, but those guys are really solid on all issues. So I don't think we have an issue with the candidates wanting to work together and to achieve an end. It's probably just education, but I think the Liberal Party has a lot to learn here as well. The Liberal Party spends a lot of time sitting on the fence or standing in the middle of the road. They're trying to win 1 or 2% of the votes back from the Labor Party, but what Labor does really well is they buddy up with the Greens. So, you've got your Marxists and your communists pretty much sticking together on that side. What the Liberal Party needs to do is, I used to be a Liberal Party member. I left the Liberals in 2020 because I wasn't happy with what they were doing. But here I am now, and I will never put them first again as it currently stands, because they are, once again, pandering to the left. They're compromising on their We Believe statement. I don't think they even believe it anymore. They need to come back to the more conservative or more libertarian side of politics and start to restore their basic belief, and present some vision and some principles. Stand firm on principles, because if you don't stand firm on your principles, you believe in nothing, and there'll be no reason to vote for you. You might as well vote Labor, because there is no significant point of difference. So, in the upper house last election, in most states, there was about 12% of the vote that went to what you would call minor right-wing parties. The Liberals recover that vote in the form of preferences, and they can govern again one day. But until they do that, they're going to spend quite a long time in opposition just saying, hey, Alpo sucks, they're a bit worse than us, vote for us. That's not good enough. Present a vision, some values, some genuine substance. Like, how cool would it be to see the Liberal Party step up and say, we want to see an Australia where, once again, a single income family can buy a home and support their life. You can spend more time with your kids. And we're going to fully review tax laws. We're going to repeal legislation to allow you to do that, because we're sick of this Ponzi scheme and we want to get back to the basics. Like, how amazing would that be and refreshing for the Australian people? But I just don't have the confidence. That's why the minor parties need to exist as the anchor to the Liberal Party to pull them back.
Absolutely. And look, it is even more so at it. I know you're not from Victoria, but on Victoria, it's a complete and utter disaster. The state Liberals here have not learned anything. They're making the same mistakes, that they lack introspection. I think my impression when I look at the state Liberals in hindsight, and I saw Billboard Chris recently gave John Pizzuto a friendly visit to his
That was fantastic.
electoral office.
Yeah.
But they've been, but by installing this John Pizzuto character, the way he attacked Moira Deeming, they clearly haven't learned anything from their last disastrous election result. I think my impression of the Victorian Liberals is they just want to, they're content with just staying in Parliament as the opposition party and having their jobs. Essentially, their comfortable seats and getting their comfortable pay packet.
Yeah.
So,
and for as long as they're demonising true Liberals like Moira, they will remain in opposition. A couple of them might keep their comfortable jobs, but how do you sleep at night not giving it everything you've got in politics? Like, my theory on politics, Senator Babbitt has said openly that he doesn't want to be there forever. But while he's there, he'll give it everything he's got. He'll stand true to his values. And what he wants to do is inspire other people to step up and take his job, take over and have a crack, because you're better off going really hard for 6 years than sitting there for 60 years and watching the country slowly slip away.
Absolutely. And the Labor Party, the Victorian Labor Party, and a few other shady characters that were working from behind the scenes were banking on the fact, because you mentioned ignorance of a lot of people having ignorance over our political system. So in the last state election, they set up these fake parties like the Sack Dan Andrews Party. People saw that name, they voted for it without doing their due diligence and not realizing that that was actually set up by the other side. And the intention was just to, shift votes away from the other minor parties. It's quite insidious what they did, and actually criminal.
Yeah, and Victorian State Parliament is the exemption to what I said before, because you do still have group voting tickets whereby the parties can nominate a flow of preferences, and it does go that way. That's the exception to the rule, and I think for as long as you have a Labor Party government in that state, I wouldn't see too many changes to the way that works, because that serves them and it serves their re-election.
Absolutely. Now, Michael, have you got any, is there anything else that you would like to cover off? I really want to give you the floor in the last 5 to 10 minutes of our podcast.
Yeah, look, the other thing I'd touch on from Senator Babbitt's perspective is vaccine indemnity bill. That's a really important piece of legislation that Senator Babbitt introduced last year. What it would do is, should it pass, which we're hoping to bring it back to Parliament again later this year, but should it pass, it would mean that no longer can indemnity be granted to pharmaceutical companies for a use of a vaccine. And what indemnity is a blank check, essentially. So in 2020, the government, or it actually wasn't the minister, it was just a bureaucrat that signed the contracts. But they signed contracts which we can't see, but I know from the federal budget papers that they included indemnity clauses, because it shows as a, what is it called? An unquantifiable contingent liability, which means we don't know how much money it will cost. It's unquantifiable, but it's as a result of this contract we've signed, which we can't show you because it's commercial in confidence. So
they gave them a blank check.
A blank check. And it was signed for every pharmaceutical company, and they have also signed indemnity since then for the Moderna manufacturing plant, which is going to be set up in Victoria. So we have granted indemnity since the pandemic as well. So we're super worried that this has become a precedent, and there's massive risks being taken by pharmaceutical companies because they're going to behave like any corporate would when they've got no responsibility, right? If you can produce a product and not be financially responsible for the consequences, I think you're probably going to subliminally take a few more risks to maybe fast track things a little bit, because there's money to be made and there's no risk to be held by you, right? So that's something important. But also economically, I think we've had successive governments of economic vandalism. The amount of debt that was accumulated by the previous Liberal government and the amount of spending that the current Labor government is doing federally I think it's unconscionable. Things like the NDIS, which is already bigger than Medicare, it's expected to reach, I think, $125 billion a year by 2034. So in 10 years' time, it'll be $125 billion. This year, it'll be about $41 billion. So think about that rate of exponential growth of spending and just consider what that might mean for us and our children in terms of tax rates and how we're going to pay for that kind of spending. Other things economically, like, I don't know if anyone realizes during the pandemic, but there was this thing called the Term Funding Facility that the RBA provided to the banks. It was $188 billion at 0.1% for 3 years. Now, the banks got that money for 3 years, guaranteed at 0.1%. Now, there's a lot of printing, there was a lot of borrowing by the government, but this money has resulted in a massive run on house prices because capital was cheap. It was being assessed at a really low rate for that period of time. And as a result, in some places, we've seen house prices go up 50 to 100% within 3 years. So if you haven't bought a house and you don't own a house yet, you are at a massive disadvantage, and the gap between rich and poor has widened astronomically. And because house prices have gone up so much, rents are running, not only because of immigration, but also because of the sheer price of a house and the yield that's required to fund that investment, right? So I could go on for days with the economic vandalism that we see, but really there's no will within either major party to get it under control, to pay debt, and to simplify and reduce our taxes. There is no political courage there. But that's what we need. If we want inflation to be under control and housing to be more affordable, how good would it be for the government to run a massive surplus, reduce the bureaucracy, start to repay debt, and take money out of the economy to reduce the amount of capital in circulation, which will mean that housing and everything will be more affordable for the longer term. But once again, courage and a bit of foresight required there.
Now, Michael, you've got some brilliant ideas and you're very articulate, and these ideas resonate with our audience. What does the future hold for you? Will we be seeing more of you? Will we see you in public life?
Well, I'm enjoying my job for now, Leon, and I've got 3 young kids. So that's my priority, is to be a good dad and a good husband. They're 8, 6, and 4. So if I can't be a good dad and a good husband, I'm never going to be a good politician. But I really love supporting Senator Babbitt because he's not scared to take the arrows. I'm sort of that guy that sits behind him trying to hold him up and help him out a bit every now and then. But really, he's bold, he doesn't hold back, and he risks a lot every time he goes out on an issue. But, you know, he does it out of integrity, and because he just can't be quiet, he's got to say the truth. But yeah, I think I will run again one day. I don't know when. Politics is one of those games that, you know, it's you don't know, and I don't want to plan to be a politician if it's not right. But I'll just do the best I can and try and raise my children with good Christian values, as I'm a believer, and that's really important for me, my relationship with God. But yeah, I don't know. I've got a lot of irons in the fire, doing a lot of different things, but I'm loving the variety, and I really want to do something that helps people, you know, because I know the government in general doesn't care too much about them. So you get a lot of joy in life trying to help people who are in a tough time or struggling. So whether that's politics, absolutely. I've got an itch that I need to scratch. So I'll probably have a crack again one day, but we'll see when the time is right.
I think there was like a famous. Yeah, well, I think there's a famous came from a Greek statesman. I forget his name. That doesn't matter. But he made a statement that might resonate with people. If you don't take an interest in politics, politics will eventually take an interest in you, and that's what we've seen in the last 4 years, unfortunately. Michael, how do people find you on social media?
I just look up my name, Michael Arbin, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I spend way too much time on those platforms. So sorry, it's X now, not Twitter, isn't it? But
that's right, X.
If you want to see a bit of truth and you want to see me calling out politicians often, yeah, jump on X, Instagram, or Facebook. Facebook seems to be my biggest following, sadly, because I think it's the older generations that are starting to take a bit more interest. We really need to get some more youth involved in politics. But I don't know, I'm starting to see some more young men emerge, especially with influencers like, Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. They're learning a lot from those sorts of guys, just to think and to question what they've been told. But it takes a while to sort of unlearn what society has taught you through your whole education, doesn't it? So
Exactly.
that's our mission, is to prevent an alternate view, but to present an alternate view, but always I will never say anything that I can't back up. And it's really important that we stick to what is verifiable and true, because that's bad enough. You don't have to make it up.
Definitely. And that's a good point that you made. I noticed that too. It's more so the older generation that seems to be more awake. The younger generation seems to be more indoctrinated, which is unfortunate. But obviously, you're working hard in the background trying to change that.
Yeah, and I look back on my own life, Leon, and I didn't know what I know now 5-10 years ago either. So as you get older, you experience hardship in life, you mature, you grow in your character. And as you grow in your character, you become bolder and more hungry for the truth and less scared to speak it.
Absolutely. What I'm going to do also is I'm going to put your social media links in the description so people know how to find you. So everyone, I would encourage you all to go out and follow Michael on his socials, on X, on Facebook and Instagram. So make sure you do that. Michael, Arbon, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on Cafe Locked-Out. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Leon. God bless you, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.